The station's environmental logs recorded the temperature of the lower gutter at 4 degrees above freezing that night, and I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because everything that follows happened in that cold on a bench nobody ever cleaned, in a district the trade authority didn't bother to name. I was not there. I want to be honest about that from the start, because you deserve honesty before you get the rest of it. I am a records adjudicator for the Sable Reach Trade Compact, 3rd tier, which means my job for the last 11 years has been reading manifests, cross-referencing tax evasions, and occasionally being handed a file so strange that I have to read it 4 times before I believe it happened at all. This is one of those files. I've spent the better part of a month reconstructing it from station security footage, medical logs, a diary, and one very long, very quiet conversation with the man at the center of it, who did not want to talk to me and only did so because I promised him I would get it right. So let me get it right. His name was Adrian Voss, and by every metric the compact uses to measure a life, he was failing. He was 34 years old, a colonist from a terraforming settlement called Toland's Reach that had gone bankrupt 18 months earlier when the corporate backers pulled funding and left 11,000 people stranded on a half-finished world with atmospheric scrubbers running on borrowed time. He'd made it off-world with the evacuation convoy, which sounds like good fortune until you understand what evacuation convoys actually are. They are not rescues. They are polite abandonments. You get a seat, you get your name struck from a ledger, and then you get dropped at the nearest transit hub with whatever you could carry and a debt to the shipping line that will follow you for the rest of your life. Adrian ended up on Corvus Waypoint, a trade station wedged into a Lagrange point, between 2 mining systems, the kind of place that exists purely because ships need somewhere to refuel and nobody wants to build anything nicer than absolutely necessary. He worked cargo loading when there was cargo to load. He slept in a rented berth the size of a coffin when he had the credits, and when he didn't, he slept in the lower ring in the gutter district, where the station's climate control was an afterthought, and the deck plating still had the original manufacturer's stamp because nobody had bothered to replace it in 40 years. I need you to understand what kind of man Adrian was before I tell you what he did, because otherwise it won't make sense. He was not a saint. He was not a hero waiting for his moment. He was tired. He was hungry, more often than not. He'd stopped writing to his sister back on the resettlement world because he didn't know what to tell her that wasn't a lie. And the one thing he still did, the one habit he had not let the last 18 months beat out of him, was that he shared what little he had with whoever had less. That's it. That's the whole secret of him. He wasn't extraordinary in the way the histories like to dress people up as extraordinary. He was extraordinary the way a lot of humans are extraordinary, which is to say, quietly, stubbornly, and without any expectation of reward. The old woman had been in the gutter district for at least 4 months before Adrian ever spoke to her. Station security had logs on her, filed under the designation unregistered transient, species unconfirmed, which is bureaucratic shorthand for we don't know who this is and we don't care enough to find out. She kept to a corner near the recycling access behind the noodle stalls, wrapped in a thermal blanket that had been salvaged from a decommissioned lifeboat kit, and she did not beg the way the other transients begged. She didn't hold out a hand or call out to passers-by. She just sat, very still, very quiet, watching the crowds the way you'd watch weather you knew was going to get worse. Her species wasn't native to the region. The medical examiner's report, which I've read more times than I care to admit, describes her physiology as consistent with a Velcarin bloodline, pale gray skin with a faint luminescence along the collarbones that fades with age, elongated fingers with an extra joint at the second knuckle, eyes that shift color slightly depending on ambient light. Velcarin are not common travelers. Their home system sits deep in Imperial Core territory, heavily restricted, heavily guarded, and the idea of a Velcarin elder living in the gutter of a fourth-rate trade station should have struck someone as strange. It didn't. Nobody looked closely enough to be struck by anything. Nobody except Adrian. He told me later that the first time he really actually saw her, not just registered her as part of the scenery the way you register a stain on a wall, was on a night when he was coming off a 16-hour loading shift with a ration bar in his pocket that was supposed to be his dinner. He said she was shivering so hard her teeth were clicking, this dry, brittle sound like a bad engine part, and something about it stopped him mid-stride. He said, and I'm quoting him directly here, because I wrote it down while he said it, I don't know why that night I'd walked past her 100 times. I think I was just tired enough that I'd stopped pretending I had somewhere better to be. He sat down next to her. He didn't say anything grand. He didn't announce himself as a good Samaritan or ask if she needed help in that performative way people sometimes do when they want credit for kindness. He just unwrapped the ration bar, broke it in half, and held one half out to her. She looked at it for a long moment. "Tea," Adrian said. Her eyes were the strangest thing about her. Pale amber shot through with threads of violet, and they had a quality to them that didn't fit the rest of her, a kind of alertness, a kind of dignity that the rags and the cold hadn't managed to strip away. She took the food. She ate slowly, carefully, like someone who had once been taught table manners in a very different life, and hadn't entirely forgotten them even now. That was the first night. It became a habit after that, the way habits form without anyone deciding to form them. Adrian would finish his shift, and if he had food, he'd bring half of it to the corner by the recycling access. Sometimes it was a ration bar. Sometimes it was actual station food, a noodle cup or a piece of fruit he'd bought with credits. He didn't really have to spare. He never asked her name. She never offered it. They didn't talk much, not at first. He said the silences weren't uncomfortable. He said it was the first thing in 18 months that it felt like it wasn't transactional, wasn't survival, wasn't just another grinding negotiation with a universe that had stopped caring whether he made it or not. I want to pause here and tell you something about the political situation at the time, because it matters for what comes later, and because I think it's important you understand just how enormous the thing sitting in that gutter actually was. Even though nobody, including Adrian, had the faintest idea, the Velcaran Empire is by tonnage of territory and depth of history one of the oldest continuously governing powers in the Orion Arm. End of footnote. Its current sovereign, Empress Iliara Thessane Vel, ascended the throne 9 years prior to the events of this story, under circumstances that were, to put it mildly, murky. Her mother, the Dowager Empress Corinne Vel, vanished during what the official record calls a diplomatic retreat to an unlisted world and was declared dead in absentia 3 years later, after an exhaustive search turned up nothing. I want to stress that word, exhaustive. The Velcaran state security apparatus, the Ashkeep Directorate, is not known for half measures. They deployed assets across 17 systems. They interrogated, by some accounts, over 4,000 individuals with any conceivable connection to the Dowager's itinerary. They found nothing. No body, no wreckage, no ransom demand, no trace. The going theory, whispered in diplomatic circles but never stated on any official record, was assassination, likely orchestrated by a faction within the Empress's own court that had opposed Corian's increasingly liberal reforms, particularly her push to grant expanded autonomy to border colonies and open trade corridors to species the old guard considered beneath imperial dignity. It was, in the coldest possible reading, a plausible motive, and Empress Iliara had spent 9 years unable to prove it, unable to disprove it, and unable, by her own account and later statements, to stop looking. There is a detail in the security archives that I find almost unbearable now, knowing what I know. 6 months before her disappearance, Dowager Empress Corinne signed an executive directive over the strenuous objection of her council, opening a new trade concession at a station called Corvus Waypoint. It was a minor policy footnote at the time. Nobody connected it to anything. It was just a woman who believed, apparently more than her advisors did, that the fringe systems deserved a chance to matter. She had been sitting on a bench 400 meters from that concession's cargo bay for 4 months, wrapped in a lifeboat blanket, eating half of a stranger's ration bar, and not one soul on that station. Not customs, not security, not the trade authority that owed its very presence there to her signature, recognized her. Adrian certainly didn't. To him, she was just an old woman, who was cold and hungry and alone. And that was reason enough. The relationship between them deepened slowly over the following weeks. Adrian started noticing details he hadn't before. The way she sometimes corrected her own posture when she thought no one was watching, sitting straighter for a moment before letting herself slump back down like a habit she'd trained out of herself but never quite lost. The way her speech, when she did speak, carried a formal cadence, an old-fashioned structure to her sentences that didn't match the rough trade common most transients picked up on stations like this. He asked her once gently where she was from originally, and she'd smiled, this thin, tired smile, and said only, "Somewhere, I am no longer welcome." He didn't push. That was one of the things I came to admire about him most as I put this story together. He didn't push. He didn't see her as a mystery to solve or a story to extract. He saw a person who was cold and alone, and he showed up, and that was the whole of his ambition. Her health began declining sharply about 6 weeks before the end. Adrian noticed the cough first, a wet, rattling thing that shook her narrow frame every few minutes. Then the tremor in her hands got worse, bad enough that she started spilling whatever she tried to eat. He tried more than once to get her to see the station medical clinic, but Corvus Waypoint's clinic charged for unregistered transients at triple the standard rate, specifically to discourage them from using it, a policy that exists on 100 stations just like it across the reach, dressed up in the language of resource allocation and meaning. In practice, we would rather you die quietly, somewhere else. Adrian didn't have the credits. He tried anyway. He went to the clinic twice, asked about payment plans, asked if there was some kind of charity fund, and was turned away both times, with the particular bureaucratic gentleness that institutions use when they want you to feel like the rejection was somehow your own fault for asking. So he did what he could. He gave her more of his food, even when it meant less for himself. He gave her his own thermal liner off his jacket when the temperature dropped further during a station-wide power conservation cycle. He started sitting with her longer, not just dropping food and leaving, but staying, talking, filling the silence with whatever small, useless updates from his own life he thought might distract her from the pain. He told me he used to talk to her about Toland's Reach, about the terraforming project, about the way the sky there had turned this particular shade of orange in the evenings, before everything fell apart. And she would listen, really listen, with an attentiveness that he said made him feel, for the first time in a long time, like a person instead of a problem to be managed. On what would turn out to be the last night, Adrian had exactly one thing of value in his possession, a full ration pack, sealed, unopened, that he'd been saving, because it was the closest thing to a real meal he'd had access to in a week. He'd been planning to eat it himself. He was, by his own account, running on fumes, his own body starting to show the wear of months of malnutrition, and any reasonable calculation would have told him to keep it. He gave it to her instead. He didn't split it this time. He told me that when he sat down next to her that night and saw how bad she looked, gray around the mouth, breathing shallow, he just knew. The way you sometimes know things without being able to explain how. That there wasn't going to be a tomorrow where the math of splitting a meal in half mattered anymore. So he gave her the whole thing. He said she tried to refuse at first, pushing it back toward him with hands that could barely grip, and he just closed her fingers around it and said something that the diary he was keeping records almost word for word. He said, "You've had less than me for longer than me. Let me do this one thing right." She ate slowly. He sat with her while she did, the two of them wedged into that gap between the recycling unit and the cold station wall, the noodle stall lights flickering 30 meters away, casting everything in this dim, greasy orange glow. When she finished, she didn't hand the wrapper back. She just held it in her lap for a while, staring at nothing, and then she started to talk. She told him about a garden. That's the detail that undoes me every time I read the transcript of Adrian's account, because it's such a small, human thing, no pun intended, given what we later learned about her. She told him about a garden she'd once kept, full of flowering plants from a dozen worlds, and how she used to spend her mornings there before the responsibilities of her life pulled her away to matters she found, in retrospect, far less important than she'd believed at the time. She told him she missed the smell of wet soil after rain. She told him she had a daughter and that she hoped, wherever her daughter was now, that she had found some measure of peace, Because peace, she said, was the thing she herself had run out of time to find. Adrian didn't know what any of that meant. He had no reason to. To him it was just the rambling of a dying woman finding comfort in memory. The kind of thing you let a person say without interrupting, because interrupting would be its own kind of cruelty. Her breathing got shallower as the night went on. Cheating. Adrian said he considered more than once running for help, but the clinic wouldn't have taken her without payment. He didn't have. And moving her seemed crueler than letting her stay where she was, wrapped in whatever warmth he could still offer. So he stayed. He held her hand, which he said felt impossibly light, like the bones underneath had gone hollow, and he kept talking to her in a low, steady voice. About nothing in particular. About Toland's Reach, about the orange sky, about anything he could think of to keep some thread of ordinary human contact running between them until the very end. She died a little after the 3rd hour of the station's night cycle, according to the timestamp on the security footage that later became part of the official investigation. Titan. Adrian said she went quiet mid-breath, so gently that he didn't realize at first that it had happened, that he kept talking for almost a full minute before the absence of her breathing against his arm finally registered. He sat with her body for a long time after that. The security footage shows him there for nearly 2 hours, unmoving, before a station sanitation drone finally flagged the location for a routine sweep and a human security officer was dispatched to process what the system had logged simply as unregistered, transient, deceased, cause unknown. It was that officer, a woman named Petra Ilson, who I later interviewed for this record, who noticed the ring. She told me she almost missed it. The old woman's hands were curled slightly, the way hands often go after death, and the ring had slipped around so the setting faced her palm rather than out. Petra said she only caught it because the metal, even dulled by grime and years of neglect, caught the stall lights in a way that plastic or cheap alloy simply doesn't. She crouched down, gently turned the hand, and found herself looking at a signet ring, heavy, old, engraved with a sigil. She didn't recognize at first 3 interlocking rings around a central star rendered in a metal that her handheld scanner flagged, with a small blinking error code, as an alloy composition inconsistent with any registered civilian manufacturing standard. Petra told me she almost logged it as costume jewelry and moved on. It was the scanner error that stopped her. In her 11 years of station security work, she said she'd never seen a scanner flag a piece of jewelry as unable to classify. Usually it just tells you what it is. This one essentially threw up its hands. So she did what any competent officer does when something doesn't fit the pattern. She photographed it, logged it, and submitted it to the station's central registry for identification. Mostly, she admitted, because she didn't want to be the one who threw away evidence if this turned out to matter. And partly, she said, because something about the whole scene, the man sitting in the cold holding a stranger's hand for 2 hours, the care with which the body had been wrapped in what was clearly his own jacket made her feel like this death deserved more attention than the system was inclined to give it. That decision, that one small act of a tired security officer choosing to do her job a little more thoroughly than strictly required, is the hinge on which this entire story turns. The registry query took 4 days to produce a result, which tells you something about how understaffed and overwhelmed a station like Corvus Waypoint actually is. When the result came back, it didn't come back from the station's own database. It came back flagged, escalated, and forwarded automatically to a priority channel that Petra didn't even know existed on her terminal, because the ring's sigil, once cross-referenced against a restricted heraldic archive, maintained under Imperial authority and mirrored for reasons of interstellar law enforcement cooperation on compact registry servers, matched an entry with a classification so high that Petra's terminal simply displayed a lockout notice and a contact code for the Velkern Imperial Household Office. She told me her first thought was that she'd broken something. Her second thought, when she'd read the lockout notice more carefully, was that she needed to call her supervisor immediately, because whatever she just found was very obviously not her problem to handle alone. I won't walk you through every bureaucratic step of what happened next, because frankly it would bore you, and it bored most of the people living through it too. Diplomatic verification is slow by design. But I will tell you the shape of it. Within 6 hours, a formal inquiry had been lodged by the Velkarin household office requesting full custody of the remains and all associated personal effects, citing, without elaboration, matters of state sensitivity. Within 12 hours, a secondary verification team, this one, composed of actual Velkarin forensic specialists rather than remote analysts, had been dispatched via a fast courier vessel that, according to the shipping logs I obtained, exceeded standard civilian velocity limits by a margin that would have gotten anyone else a hefty fine. Within 36 hours, the body had been positively identified through a combination of genetic markers and a bone density scan that matched medical records sealed 9 years earlier as Dowager Empress Corinne Vel. I want you to imagine what that moment must have been like inside the Velkarin household office. 9 years of searching, 4,000 interrogations, 17 systems combed by state security assets with essentially unlimited resources, and the answer, the entire time, was a woman sitting on a bench outside a noodle stall on a fourth-rate trade station. Her own directive had helped establish, eating half a ration bar, shared by a man who had nothing. The investigation into how she got there and why she never tried to make contact with anyone who could have helped her took much longer to piece together, and some of it, honestly, is still classified in ways that even my clearance doesn't reach. But the fragments that have been made public paint a picture that is, I think, worth sharing here, because it changes the shape of everything that came before it. The official Imperial finding, released roughly 4 months after the events on Corvus Waypoint, states that Dowager Empress Corinne had indeed been the target of an assassination attempt during her diplomatic retreat, orchestrated by elements of the conservative court faction opposed to her reforms. The attempt had partially succeeded in the sense that her security retinue was slaughtered and her transport vessel destroyed, but she herself survived, ejected in an emergency pod that malfunctioned during atmospheric entry and left her stranded, injured, and with no working communications on a Moon 3 systems away from anywhere anyone was looking. What happened in the years between that crash and her arrival on Corvus Waypoint remains only partially reconstructed, but the report indicates she eventually made her way through, means the investigation could not fully verify, likely a combination of trade vessels and sheer determination, into fringe space, deliberately avoiding any official channel or checkpoint where her identity might be flagged. The report's language here is clinical, but the implication underneath it is not. She believed, correctly as it turned out, that whoever had orchestrated the attempt on her life still held enough influence within the court and the security apparatus that any attempt to reveal herself through official channels risked simply finishing what the assassination had started. She chose, instead, to disappear completely, to become no one, in the hope that no one would be safer than a hunted empress. She never tried to contact her daughter. The report suggests this was deliberate too, a calculation that any communication, however careful, however encrypted, risked being intercepted, and that the risk to Iliara, who was at the time consolidating a fragile and contested claim to the throne, outweighed whatever comfort a reunion might have offered. She chose, in other words, to let her daughter believe she was dead, rather than risk giving her enemies a thread to pull that might unravel everything Iliara was fighting to hold together. I find that almost impossible to sit with, honestly. 9 years of silence, chosen deliberately as an act of protection for a daughter who spent every one of those years still looking. Her health declined steadily over that period, worsened by injuries from the original crash that were never properly treated, worsened further by the simple grinding attrition of years spent in fringe space with no resources, no support, and no identity she could safely reveal. By the time she reached Corvus Waypoint, roughly a year before her death, she was already, by the medical examiner's later assessment, in the advanced stages of organ failure that no amount of station clinic treatment would likely have reversed, even if she'd had the credits to access it. She kept the ring the entire time. That detail is in Adrian's account too, something she told him one of the nights before the end. She said she'd thought about selling it more than once. In the early years, when the hunger was bad enough to make anything feel negotiable, she said she never could bring herself to do it because it was the last thing that still connected her to the person she used to be and to the daughter she'd left behind to protect. I think about that a great deal. A woman who ruled in every practical sense. Half a galactic arm, choosing to starve rather than part with a ring, because the ring was memory, and memory was the only inheritance she had left to hold on to. The formal notification reached Empress Iliara Thessane Vel on the evening of the 4th day, delivered in person by the head of her household office, a woman named Director Kessa Morvain, who I later obtained a partial transcript of the conversation from, through channels I am not at liberty to fully describe, but which I have every confidence are accurate. According to that transcript, Iliara's first response, upon being told her mother's remains had been positively identified, was not a question about the circumstances of the death. It was a single question, asked twice, about whether her mother had been alone. Director Morvain, to her credit, did not lie or soften the truth to make it easier to hear. She told the Empress everything the investigation had established, that her mother had spent her final months destitute, unregistered, essentially invisible to a system that existed in no small part because of a policy she herself had signed into existence, that she had died on a bench in a gutter district of a station most imperial citizens had never heard of, and that in her final hours she had not been alone at all, because a human colonist, himself barely surviving, had been sharing his food with her for weeks and had held her hand through the night she died, having given her on that final evening everything he had left to give. The transcript records a long silence after that, and then it records the Empress asking for the man's name. Adrian, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening. In the days following the old woman's death, he'd gone back to his life, such as it was, still picking up cargo shifts when they were available, still sleeping wherever he could afford to, still grieving, in his own quiet way, the loss of the one relationship in 18 months that had felt like something other than survival. He told me he thought about her often in those days, wondered idly in the way you wonder about people whose full story you never got to hear, who she had been before the gutter, what garden she'd tended, what daughter she'd hoped had found peace. He had absolutely no framework for connecting any of that to the notification that arrived at his rented berth 8 days after her death, delivered by a station security officer, accompanied by 2 individuals in formal Velcaran diplomatic dress, requesting, with a level of politeness that Adrian said immediately made him suspicious that he was in some kind of trouble, that he accompany them to a secure conference suite in the station's upper administrative ring. He told me he spent the entire walk there, running through every possible infraction he might have committed, unpaid docking fees, some cargo manifest discrepancy, anything that might explain why the Empire itself apparently wanted to speak with him. He said the last thing on his mind, the absolute last thing, was that it had anything to do with her. The conference suite, when he arrived, had been cleared of all but a handful of people. Director Morvain was there, along with 2 members of what Adrian later learned was the Imperial Security Detail, standing at a distance that was respectful but unmistakably watchful. And at the center of the room, standing rather than seated, dressed not in the elaborate ceremonial regalia Adrian half expected from every documentary he'd ever half watched about Imperial court life, but in a simple dark traveling coat that could have belonged to anyone, was Empress Iliara Thessane Vel herself. I want to dwell on that choice of dress for a moment because I think it tells you something important about her, or at least about the woman she chose to be in that particular room. She had traveled, we later learned, on an unmarked diplomatic vessel with a skeleton crew and minimal fanfare, specifically to avoid the kind of state visit spectacle that would have turned this meeting into a political event rather than what she clearly wanted it to be, which was simply one person thanking another. Adrian said he didn't recognize her at first. He said it took him a full 3 or 4 seconds standing in the doorway for the pieces to click into place, the face he'd seen only in passing on news feeds he'd never paid much attention to, the bearing that even in plain clothes carried an unmistakable weight of authority, and he said his first instinct, the honest, unfiltered instinct of a man who has spent 18 months being ground down by institutions much larger than himself, was to apologize for something, anything, on the assumption that he must have done wrong. He told me the Empress's first words to him were, "Please sit down. You look like you haven't slept." Which, he admitted, was true. What followed, according to both Adrian's own account and the partial record Director Morvain later allowed to be released, was not a formal audience in any sense that imperial protocol would recognize. The Empress asked Morvain and the security detail to wait outside. She sat across from Adrian at the small conference table, and for the better part of 2 hours she asked him questions, not as a sovereign interrogating a subject, but as a daughter trying desperately to reconstruct the final chapter of a mother she'd been forced to mourn twice, once 9 years ago on a fiction, and once again now on a truth far harder to carry. She asked what her mother had talked about. Adrian told her about the garden, about the flowering plants from a dozen worlds, about the smell of wet soil after rain. He said the Empress's composure, which he described as almost unnervingly steady through most of the conversation, cracked for the first time at that detail, because apparently the garden had been real, had been a specific place in the old imperial residence that Iliara remembered from her own childhood. And hearing that her mother had spent her dying months holding on to that memory rather than any detail of politics or power was, in the Empress's own words later reported by Morvain, the moment she finally allowed herself to believe her mother had, in some small way, been happy at the end. She asked what her mother had said about her daughter to Adrian, with what I can only describe as remarkable tact, for a man who had no idea he was speaking to that very daughter, until moments earlier, told her carefully and honestly that the old woman had spoken of her daughter with nothing but hope, that she'd said she hoped wherever her daughter was, she had found peace, and that she'd said it not with grief, but with a kind of stubborn faith, the faith of someone who believed, all evidence to the contrary, that things would eventually turn out right. Adrian told me that was the point in the conversation where the Empress had to stop talking for a while. He said he didn't try to fill the silence. He said he'd learned, over the preceding weeks, that some silences aren't meant to be filled, that some silences are their own kind of conversation, and you honor them best by simply staying present inside them. Eventually, the Empress asked the question that I think mattered most to her, the one that Director Morvain later told me had been the entire unspoken purpose of the journey. She asked why. Why had he given a stranger, a woman he owed nothing, a woman who could offer him nothing in return, the last of what little he had? She asked it, Adrian said, not as an accusation, but with genuine searching bewilderment, the bewilderment of someone raised inside a system where power and scarcity are hoarded as a matter of course, trying to understand a logic that didn't fit any framework she'd been taught. Adrian's answer, which I've now heard him give, in almost the exact same words on the 2 separate occasions I interviewed him, was this. He said, "She was cold, and I wasn't cold enough yet to stop caring about that. I figured if I ever got that hungry myself, I'd want somebody to still see me as a person worth feeding, so I just tried to be that somebody first." I think about that answer a lot. I think it's the entire thesis of this story compressed into 2 sentences by a man who never once thought of himself as the subject of a story at all. The Empress, according to Morvain's account, was quiet for a long moment after that. And then she said something that later became, in a heavily edited and sanitized form, part of the official public statement the imperial household released about the whole affair, though the version Adrian actually heard was rawer and more personal than anything that made it into print. She said that she had spent 9 years believing her mother died among enemies, in violence, afraid and alone, and that the not knowing had been, in its own way, worse than grief, because grief at least has an ending and not knowing never does. She said that Adrian had given her something she had stopped believing was possible to receive, which was an ending she could actually bear to hold. Not a happy one, not one without its own terrible weight, but one where her mother, in her final hours, had been warm, had been fed, had been held by someone who saw her simply as a person deserving of kindness, rather than as a crown, a target, or a ghost. She told him that was worth more to her than any amount of state ceremony or formal gratitude could ever properly repay, and that she intended to try anyway. What happened over the following weeks, from a purely practical standpoint, is a matter of public imperial record, so I can be brief about it, though I don't think the paperwork does justice to what it actually meant. Hadrian was granted, at the Empress's direct request, full imperial citizenship, an honor rarely extended to non-Velcarin individuals, and typically reserved for cases of extraordinary diplomatic service. A trust was established in his name, sufficient not just to clear whatever debts he'd accumulated since Toland's reach, but to guarantee him security for the remainder of his life. Structured, at his own insistence when the details were being finalized, modestly, because he told Director Morvain, in a conversation she later relayed to me with what I could tell was genuine fondness, that he didn't want to be rich. He just wanted to stop being afraid. He was also, and this is the detail that I think matters most, offered a formal position within a newly established imperial charitable office, tasked specifically with identifying and supporting unregistered transient populations across trade stations throughout the Reach, the exact populations that bureaucratic systems like the one on Corvus Waypoint routinely rendered invisible. Adrian accepted that position without a moment's hesitation. He told me it was the first job he'd ever been offered that felt like it fit the shape of who he actually was, rather than the shape some employer needed him to pretend to be. The office bears an official name in Imperial records that I won't bother reciting here, because it's the kind of clunky bureaucratic title that committees produce when they're trying to honor something without quite knowing how. But informally, among the people who actually work there, and I've spoken with several of them, it's known simply as the Garden Project. I'm told that's deliberate. I'm told Adrian chose the name himself. The ring itself was returned to the imperial family, and now sits, according to Morvain, not in some grand ceremonial vault, but on a small shelf in the Empress's private study, alongside a handful of other personal items that never made it into any official display. I asked Morvain once whether the Empress ever spoke about it, and she told me only that Iliara visits that shelf on the anniversary of her mother's death every year, and that she is never willing to discuss what she says there, but that she always brings along with whatever quiet ritual she keeps to herself. A single sprig of a flowering plant that the imperial gardeners have confirmed does not grow anywhere within the palace grounds, and had to be specially cultivated from records of the old garden her mother once kept. Adrian still works for the Garden Project. Last I confirmed, he was overseeing expansion of the initiative to 14 additional stations across the fringe systems, personally reviewing every single one of the outreach postings to make sure the language wasn't the same cold bureaucratic language that let a woman like Corinne Vel sit invisible on a bench for a year before anyone noticed she was dying. He still, according to two of his colleagues I interviewed, makes a habit of sitting with people in the gutter districts of every station he visits, not as an inspection, not as a photo opportunity, but simply because, in his own words, that's still the only thing he's ever been sure he's good at. He and the Empress correspond occasionally, I'm told, mostly brief messages, mostly about the progress of the Garden Project. Though Morvain lets slip once that on the anniversary of Corinne's death each year, Adrian sends a single message, unadorned, that simply reads, "She talked about the garden again today, and I taught someone new to listen for it." I don't know what the Empress writes back. That correspondence, unlike everything else in this record, has never been released, and I don't believe it ever will be, and honestly, I think that's exactly as it should be. Some kindnesses are public record because the scale of what they touched demands it. But the quiet, private thread that still runs between a colonist who had nothing and an Empress who had everything except the one thing she wanted most, that thread, I think, belongs only to the two of them. I'll leave you with the one detail from Adrian's own diary that I haven't shared yet, because I think it's the truest ending this story has. It's dated the night after his meeting with the Empress, written in the same cramped, tired handwriting as every other entry before it. It reads, and I'm quoting exactly, "I keep thinking I did something small. Gave away food I could have eaten myself, sat with someone nobody else would sit with. That's not heroic. That's just Tuesday if you're paying attention to the people around you. I think the scariest thing about today is realizing how many people like her are sitting on benches right now that nobody's paying attention to. I don't feel like I did something remarkable. I feel like I got very, very lucky that this particular kindness got noticed. I keep wondering how many others never do." That's the whole of it. Not a story about a hero who knew what he was doing, or a plan that paid off, or a grand design finally revealed. Just a hungry man who chose on one cold night on a forgotten station to see a stranger as a person rather than a problem. And an empress who, 9 years too late for the reunion she actually wanted, finally got to know that in the end, her mother had not been alone, had not been forgotten, and had been exactly as loved as she deserved to be. If there's a lesson buried in the paperwork of this whole strange affair, and I've read enough of it now that I feel entitled to look for one, I think it's simply this. You never know whose mother you're sitting next to. You never know what crown might be hidden under a lifeboat blanket, what empire might be quietly starving on a bench outside a noodle stall, while the whole galaxy looks the other way. Adrian didn't know. He didn't need to know. He gave what he had because giving what he had was simply who he chose to be, when nobody, least of all an empire, was watching. I think that's worth remembering long after the case file closes, and the trust fund paperwork clears, and the garden project expands to its 15th station and its 16th. Somewhere out there, right now on some station nobody bothers to name, there's probably someone else sitting cold and unseen. The empire, for all its resources, needed a records officer's stubborn attention to detail, and a hungry man's stubborn decency to find the one that mattered most to it. I'd like to think we don't need an empress to show up in person for the rest of us to learn the same lesson a little sooner. This has been a full account of the Corvus Waypoint matter, filed for the permanent record and honestly, filed with more personal gratitude than my position technically permits. Some cases change the officer writing them up. This was one of mine.